A few months ago, I honestly thought reading was just going to become a small hobby, something relaxing, something productive. But the more books I read, the more uncomfortable things started to surfacing, like memories, anger, loneliness, questions I didn't know I had. And what surprised me the most wasn't that books were changing how I think. It's the way they were changing how I see people, including myself. Since February 2026, I read 11 books. Fictions, crime novels, self-help, spiritual books, politics, war history. And what surprised me the most is that the books that changed me the most weren't always the one trying to teach me something. Sometimes it was just a story about another human being trying to survive life. And somehow, those books ended up teaching me the most about myself. Two books that hit me deeply were The Year of the Hare by Arto Paasilinna and Doppler by Erlend Loe. On the surface, they are very different books, but emotionally, they feel connected. Both are about men walking away from modern life, not because they necessarily hate life, but because something inside of them feels disconnected. In The Year of the Hare, a journalist named Carlo Vatanen suddenly leaves his old life behind after hitting a hare with his car. And in Doppler, the main character isolates himself in the forest to escape society completely. It sounds so dramatic, but honestly, I think a lot of men fantasizing about disappearing sometimes. Not dying, not abandoning people, just silent. No expectations, no pressure, no constant noise. And I connected with that more than I could expect. When I used to make music, I always needed a studio. Some place where I could disappear into my own head for a while. I think that's why so many men build man caves, garages, workshops, or spend hours alone watching sports. Not because we hate people, really, or maybe, but because sometimes the world becomes too loud. These books capture that feeling perfectly, and maybe that's why they're both in my top 5 books so far. I also started reading a lot of self-help books. Think Like a Monk by Shetty, How to Love Better by Young Pueblo, Sleep Smarter by Shawn Stevenson, and something strange happened while reading them. They helped me, but they also challenged me, because self-help books can sometimes feel inspiring, and other time feel like someone is trying to hand you an answer to a question you're still figuring out for yourself. And that can be a strange experience, especially when you're trying to understand your own life at the same time. What made How to Love Better different was that I read it together with my brother. My brother and I actually have our own small book club that's been going on for over 3 months now. And hearing another perspective while reading made a huge difference. Sometimes I didn't even connect with the chapter we were reading that day. But then my brother would say something about it that completely changed how I saw it. It stopped the book from becoming too personal. It became a conversation instead. But when I read Think Like a Monk, something felt off. Not enough to make me stop reading. Not enough to make me dislike the book. But enough that I kept arguing with my head. Which was strange, because at the same time I was also learning from it. To this day I still don't fully know what to do with that book. And honestly, it probably deserves its own episode. Sleep Smarter surprised me in another way. It felt more factual, more grounded. But what really stayed with me was the structure. Daily routines, journaling, tracking habits. It made me really realize I enjoyed books that makes me interact with my own life instead of just consuming information. I don't just want inspiration anymore. I want transformation. And strangely, that idea has started to showing up outside of books too. In habits I'm building, in journaling I'm doing, and some of the projects I'm stepping into now. Which is not something I expected when I picked up my first book earlier this year. Darkness by Ragnar Jónasson was my first real Easter crime novel. And honestly, the experience around the book affected me just as much as the story itself. I was visiting my mother during Easter because my son needed help with some schoolwork. My mother is a teacher, But most importantly, she's a real reader. The type of person who can disappear into a book for 5 hours straight and finish it in one sitting. I asked her to pick out 3 crime novels for me. 2 of them were by Henning Mankell. The third one was Darkness. And even though I knew nothing about any of them, I kept reaching for the same book, Darkness. So eventually I stopped overthinking it and started reading. I grew up around books my entire life, so sitting there reading with my mother during Easter actually felt emotional. Because for the first time, I wasn't looking at readers from the outside anymore. I was one of them. I think she became proud of me. And honestly, I became proud of myself too. Especially after spending years hearing words like dyslexia attached to my identity. And the funny thing is, I almost quit the book at the beginning. I thought it was painfully slow. But then the atmosphere slowly started building. The tension, the loneliness, the coldness. And when the twist finally came, it completely blindsided me. That was the moment I understood why Nordic noir has such a strong reputation. And next Easter, I think I will be returning to that world again. One of the most powerful books I read so far was A Journey Through War and Peace by Eleanor F. Major. The book explored families affected by World War II, resistance movements, prison camps, trauma, and especially how trauma moves throughout generations. And honestly, that book stayed in my head for days because it made me think about my own father, my family, Senegal. My father was born in 1957. Senegal became independent from France in 1960, which means history wasn't that far away. Colonism wasn't some ancient thing in the textbooks. It was close, very close. And now that my father is gone, I realize I'm searching for answers I'm never fully getting. What did he experience emotionally? What fear did he suppress? What survival instinct gets passed down silently into children? And I honestly think that's part of why I'm reading now. I'm searching. I'm hoping that eventually I reach books that can help me understand what my father actually carried inside of him. Because trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it changes how people feel, people love, how they react, how they protect themselves, how they raise their children. And growing up around immigrant communities made me think about this even more. Many people came from war, poverty, political instability, and losses. And then they were expected to immediately adapt into a completely different society, learn a new language, fit into a system, behave normally. And honestly, I don't think people fully understand how psychologically brutal that can be. This book changed some of my perspective completely. Because books sometimes force you to see human beings before you see politics. God is Colorblind and Crazy Wisdom. God is Colorblind by Wilson Gueda surprised me deeply, not because it made me religious, but because it made me think differently about people, about identity, about the stories we inherit from the world around us. And the more I read, the more question it left me with. Crazy Wisdom by Chungyam Trungpa gave me a completely different experience. The book felt chaotic, spiritual, uncomfortable, but strangely peaceful at the same time. I didn't always understand what I was reading, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And somewhere between those 2 books, I found myself becoming more curious about questions I'd spent most of my life avoiding. Questions about meaning, identity, suffering, belief. Not because I suddenly found any answers, but because I became interested in asking better questions. I don't fully know why spiritual books affect me the way they do, but they seem to touch something deep inside of me, deeper than information. And I have a feeling that subject I'll be exploring a lot more in the future. I also started becoming more interested in politics over the years, mostly because I realized how little I actually understand about politics. The media shows headlines, big arguments, a lot of drama, but politics is really about people, the power, relationships, strategy, and influences. And the funny part about finding this political book was actually how I got it. I was at the flea market with some people from work. Earlier that day, I had been talking politics with one of my coworkers and joking about how my wife basically gave me a book ban because I brought home too many books. I said, I'm not allowed to buy more books. Then suddenly I looked over at the shelf and Jens Stoltenberg, a portrait, was just sitting there staring at me. I genuinely felt like the book called my name, Paul, Paul. So of course I brought another book home. Reading it surprised me because part of politics honestly felt like a high school drama. Egos, alliances, rivalries, reputation, but underneath all of that, I also saw how important communication and emotional control really are. The book made me realize that people around you can completely shape your future. In politics, in business, and in life. When I look back at all these books, none of them are really about the same thing. But emotionally, they actually are. Every single one is about a human being trying to survive life, trying to understand themselves, trying to escape pain, trying to find a meaning. And I think that's why reading has changed me so much already. Not because I suddenly became intellectual, but because books slowed me down enough to reflect on my own life. I become more honest, more thoughtful, less impulsive. I say yes less often now. I think more carefully about the people I give my energy to. And for the first time in a very long time, I genuinely feel curious about life again. I thought reading would teach me about books, but honestly, it's teaching me about people, including myself. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.